Good afternoon. Good afternoon. For those of you who share the same interest as I, we may have seen each other about 3 times this week or so. This is my third introduction of the week, and I am so excited to be introducing Professor Ann Morning, who's an associate professor of sociology at New York University. I have watched her career over the years and know that she is a rising a star, really, in the sociology of race. And it is my distinct pleasure, actually, to be able to hear you give a talk today. I'm so glad you could come out here all the way on the other coast to talk with us. So let me tell you a little bit about her. I am really excited that we have a truly comparative talk today, an international comparative talk today, because I personally have been interested in what race is like, and particularly in Italy. I know a lot about the United States, as I told Anne earlier. My heart broke a couple of weeks ago when I saw that piece on the Italian soccer player and the kinds of just rabid and vicious comments that were hurled at him. So I really want to know what she has to say about the consciousness in that particular nation state. So Ann Morning, as I said, is an associate professor of sociology at NYU. She's in a faculty affiliate at NYU Abu Dhabi. And her research interests include race, demography, and the sociology of science. For those of you who don't know, and there are a couple of people in the audience, and I'm glad you're in the audience because I know there are some doctoral students here who actually focus on race and science. She wrote an award-winning dissertation that was given the American Sociological Association's 2005 Dissertation Award, and was published in 2011 by the University of California Press. And her book is entitled The Nature of Race, How Scientists Think and Teach About Human Difference. This is an incredibly important and rich work. And while she's not talking about this today, there may be some conceptual overlap. I'm sure you can ask her about it or talk to her about it. In 2008 and 2009, she was a Fulbright scholar at the University of Milan. And she's currently a member of the U.S. Census Bureau's National Advisory Committee on Racial, Ethnic, and Other Populations. She holds her PhD in sociology from Princeton University, an MA in International Affairs from Columbia University, and a BA in Economics and Political Science from Yale University. What a pedigree, right? Wow. So it is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce Professor Ann Morning.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome. It's really a pleasure to see so many familiar faces and also meet new folks. I also want to say that Stanford has a special place in my heart because Stanford was my late mother's undergraduate institution. And every time I come here, I wonder, what was that like to be a black woman in the 1950s at Stanford? And I know a little bit from her about what it was like. She was clearly, part of the beginnings of a revolution that I think you guys at the center are carrying forward. So I'm really particularly honored to be here with you today and really just delighted to be part of your impressive program. So the research that I will talk about today is really, it's very much in the preliminary phase, so it's a work in progress, and I want to share some of my preliminary findings with you and get your ideas and feedback. It's work that I'm doing with a sociologist at the University of Milan, Marcello Maneri. And in a nutshell, you could say that this is a comparative study of the ways that Americans and Italians think about ethnic difference. So I'm going to complicate that later on, but sort of to give you a starting point, that's roughly what I will be focusing on. Now, for those of you who are familiar with my work, you'll recognize some of its relationship. That is, a lot of the ideas that I'm using in this project were ones that I developed in my book, The Nature of Race, published in 2011. Now, in that book, I was focused on Americans' conceptualizations of race. And when I use this term, as I'll be using throughout the talk, talking about concepts of race, concepts of difference, what I'm really trying to get at is something much broader than simply people's definitions, let's say their definitions of the term race, but rather I'm interested in the complex of beliefs that people have about what race is. So for example, how many races do they think there are? What are the signal characteristics of various races? How do we know which race an individual belongs to or not? Why are there races? Where do they come from? So this kind of bundle of beliefs that we tend to have about what a race is or an ethnic group or so on is really what I'm focusing on in this talk about conceptualization. Now, in my study in the United States, I was particularly interested in the extent to which Americans thought about race as a biological concept or an essentialist one. That is the idea simply that there are sort of naturally occurring groups of human beings who share certain biological characteristics and that makes them races. Versus, I was interested in seeing, in contrast, the spread of another kind of idea, the constructivist idea, right? That what races really are groups of people who get labeled by a particular society at a particular time as somehow having something in common. And these ideas will also, you'll see them taken or continued through in my work in Italy. Now, what I hope to do in the talk today is first give you some of the background and give you a sense of what, how did I come to this cross-national comparison? Then I'll talk about why, or make an argument for why we might be interested in studying concepts of difference, concepts of race, and other kinds of groupings. And then I'll spend a fair amount of time talking about Italy, so giving you background on Italy and also trying to convince you of why comparing the United States to Italy is a very fruitful kind of comparison. Then, after talking a bit about data and methods, I'll show you some of my preliminary findings and then close off with a discussion of, I think, some implications. So to start with the background and the research questions that we're posing, this project really came out of our reading of the literature on what's been called the new racism. And this term, the new racism, was coined by Martin Barker in his 1981 book of that name to describe a phenomenon that he had observed in debates about immigration in the UK in the 1970s. So as an observer of these debates around immigration, Barker argued that there was a new kind of discourse about difference that was taking hold. And he kind of described this worldview in the following words. He said this kind of worldview asserted that it is in our biology, our instincts to defend our way of life, traditions, and customs against outsiders, not because they're inferior, but because they're part of different cultures. And in another take on the idea of new racism that the French scholar Etienne Balibar proposed, he said it's a racism whose dominant theme is not biological heredity, but the unsurmountability of cultural differences. A racism which at first sight does not postulate the superiority of certain groups or peoples in relation to others, but only the harmfulness of abolishing frontiers, the incompatibility of lifestyles and traditions. So what is it that these guys thought was new about the new racism? Well, first and foremost, they argue this emphasis on cultural difference as opposed to older ideas of biological difference. For them, that was sort of a signal characteristic of what was new about this discourse. They also saw a move away from explicit claims about superior and inferior groups. So in this, supposedly in this new racism, it wasn't that some groups were better than others, they were just different and in ways that needed to be respected. But at the same time, these scholars writing about this phenomenon felt that there was also something old about what was going. That is, it was still racism, so it wasn't a total break with the past. And in particular, they argued that what was old, the old racism in the new racism, was that it basically aimed for the same objectives. That is, the bottom line was still the desire for, in the case of immigration to the UK, it was still a desire to keep out non-whites, to keep whites and not whites spatially segregated. So in that sense, it had a lot in common with older kinds of racism. Now, our project really takes its start from this literature when that literature travels beyond the UK, because this idea that there might be a new racism afoot was one that found an audience well beyond England. It's an idea that was also taken up in France by scholars there to describe discourse that they observed. And American scholars also have been active in thinking about what new racism looks like in this context. Now, as this theory of new racism traveled across different countries, it also acquired a comparative claim. And our project is really about empirically testing this claim. So as scholars started to think about the new racism theory in comparative context, a certain comparative assertion started to be repeated and again. The idea was simply that new racism was really a European and specifically a Western European kind of phenomenon, And kind of the old racism was a particularly American province. So kind of Americans were still mired in old biological thinking about race. In Europe, they were thinking and talking about this differently. Now, although this claim has been quite widespread in the literature, it really hasn't been tested empirically. And so that's really what inspired our work, to actually collect some data and try to see to what extent is it really fair to say that, you know, Europeans are thinking about race in terms very different, or thinking about difference in very different ways than than Americans are thinking about Western Europeans. Sorry, I think I messed that comparison up. Now, there are ways, though, in which we kind of tweak this hypothesis. In particular, there are two ways in which we formulate it that we think are conceptually very important. One is that although the literature focused on racism, we really see the contrast that's being made as a question of different concepts, different kinds of conceptualization. And so we use that language accordingly. So rather than talking about whether racism is cultural in the UK and biological in the US, what we really set out to ask is, you know, do Europeans have more cultural understandings or notions or association with group differences than Americans do? Do Americans conceptualize group differences in more biological terms than Europeans do? So we'll be focusing on the language of conceptualization. The other difference that we make is we also want to move away from the term race. Although racism was the topic of this original literature, we actually want to look for a term that is somewhat broader. One simple reason is that simply as we move, particularly beyond the United States, race is not necessarily the term that people are using or that are very familiar for them or resonates for them in the way that they would talk about difference. But also, I think more importantly, analytically, we are, I think, persuaded by the work of sociologists like Mara Loveman and Andreas Wimmer and Luc Vacant, who have suggested that we can think about several kinds of terms like race or ethnicity or tribe or caste as, in a sense, being part of a family of concepts that take on different meanings in different places. In the United States, we tend to associate certain things with different terms, but that nonetheless they have a kind of family resemblance. And so rather than use one term, which might be particularly resonant for us in the United States or in the US Academy, we're sort of looking for something that serves a bit more as an umbrella term to use in our comparative work. And to do that, we're going to be drawing on the historian David Hollinger's concept of communities of descent and refer to the groups that we're interested in a sense as descent-based group. Again, you can kind of interpret it in your head or translate it in your head as ethnicity, as Andreas Wimmer does, but we'll be using that term. So to pull those kind of modifications together, I think it's most accurate to say that the aim of our project is to make a comparison between the concepts of difference between descent-based groups that obtain in the United States and in Italy. Now, within that overarching objective, there are three more specific kinds of research questions that we ask. First of all, we are interested in tracing the extent to which culture and biology figure in Americans and Italians' reasonings about the nature of group differences. Second, we also want to leave open the very real possibility that beyond culture and biology, there may be other important ways in which people in these countries characterize difference. For example, Michel Lamont has written about moral boundary lines that people draw. There could be socioeconomic characteristics that our respondents pay attention to. And then finally, we want to be very agnostic about the extent to which people understand descent-based groups as having characteristics that are fixed, permanent, essential, or fluid and malleable. So we don't want to make any assumptions about, you use the word ethnicity and therefore it means that you're thinking about a fluid set of characteristics. We want to be open and see what emerges from our data. All right. What I'd like to do now is really move into the rationale for this, to talk more about why we think it's important to do work on concepts of difference and then why we choose to do it in this comparative framework. This is something that I elaborate a lot more in my other writing, so I'm going to go over this very briefly, but I'm happy to talk about it more in question and answer. In a nutshell, we argue that concepts of difference should be of interest to us as scholars because they're related to so many of the group-related, or we could even say specifically race-related phenomena that we're often interested in. So research, particularly from social psychology, suggests that there's quite a strong link between the ways that people conceptualize difference and their attitudes towards the other groups. So their prejudices, they're willing to have social contacts with people from other groups and so forth. A second reason is that clearly there are practices that we engaged in which are shaped by the conceptualization of race that we hold. So just to give you an example, the practice of taking your cheek swabs and sending your DNA to a company that purports to tell you what your racial makeup is only makes sense if you have the underlying concept that what race is a biological characteristic embedded in your body. And this holds true for policies as well. We can see the ways that policies and policy proposals also are shaped by people's assumptions about the nature of difference. And I'll take just a recent example from a couple of years ago. The Nobel Prize winner, James Watson, who says on the public record that we should not be sending foreign aid monies to African nations because everybody knows that blacks are naturally intellectually less endowed than whites. So sending money in development aid to sub-Saharan African countries is just a waste of time, right? There's a policy proposal anchored in a particular concept of the nature of racial difference. Now, if you grant that it's important to think about concepts of difference, why do it in comparative perspective? Now, as you all know, comparative work has many kinds of advantages for any kind of question, and I won't spend time on those here. But I want to point out that with respect to American concepts of difference, that I think there's something particularly fruitful for us to be paying attention to what is going on in Western Europe. And that is because, in a way, we might think of Western Europeans as being where we will be years from now in terms of thinking about ethno-racial diversity in our societies. That is, in the United States, for so much of our history, the ethnic diversity of our country has really been fueled by processes like slavery and territorial conquest. That really historically has been the motor of how we've come to be an ethno-racially diverse country. In Europe, certainly today, that motor instead is voluntary immigration. Of course, we are now becoming more like Western Europe in that way. It's really now voluntary immigration that is changing the demographic makeup of our country. And so I think there's something particularly worthwhile for us to ask ourselves whether immigration processes lend themselves to particular ways of thinking about group difference that might be different than the sorts of concepts that in the United States we've had grounded out from the experience of slavery and so forth. So I think there's a kind of a perspective, maybe looking at what's coming down the pike, that we might have in the back of our minds when we look at the Western European experience. Okay. What I'd like to spend more time on right now, though, is making the case for why a comparison with Italy. The new racism comparative theory is explicitly a comparison between the United States and Western Europe. So why choose Italy to be, in a sense, our representative of Western Europe? Now, I want to say at the outset that we're not trying to make the claim that Italy or any other country is somehow just sort of typical and sums up all the characteristics of other Western European countries. There's no kind of single most typical European country. However, we do want to suggest that Italy shares a lot of important characteristics in this realm with many of its Western European neighbors, starting with its very large inflows of immigrants in recent years. You can see here from these numbers that Italy is really right at the top with many of its neighbors in terms of both the numbers of foreigners that it has in the population, as well as the share that they make up of the national population. And with that presence, that immigrant presence in Italy, it also brings other characteristics that are similar to other Western European societies. So immigration in Italy, as in many of its neighbors, is a very high-profile political and media issue. So it's on the table every day for Italians throughout the country. Italy also is part of a process, right, of Europeanization, right, through its membership in the European Union, that's led to a certain discourse and thinking about Europeanness, about what it is to be European and who is not European. And in fact, you see this very poignantly in the Italian case, where you even have a new word, extracomunitari, to describe people from outside the community, outside the European community, right? A term that is, as you can imagine, it's not really reserved for Americans or Swiss people, right? It's a term for people from Morocco, right, and Pakistan and so forth. Now, in addition, though, to these, we could say maybe sort of structural characteristics that Italy shares with its neighbors, I want to suggest also that there's some cultural characteristics that it shares that I think are also relevant. And in particular, Italy, like some of its neighbors, has a certain national self-image as a particularly tolerant, racism-free society. And I would argue that it's akin to the French idea of universal republicanism, right? So a nation where it doesn't matter what your color is, as you're a French citizen, you're all equal before the law. Or the Dutch idea of being a particularly tolerant society. Italy has its own version of that, and that's summed up in the phrase Italiani brava gente, which basically means Italians, good people, right? It's an idea that is, it's linked in part to a certain kind of stereotype about an Italian personality, but it's also quite related to a vision of Italy's place in the world, particularly in World War II and beyond. So there's very much this idea that, in World War II, Italy, Italians were opposed to the Germans, right? This totally ignores the fact that they were allied with the Germans, but somehow, they were the good guys, and those nasty, mean Nazis came and tried to round up Jews, but Italians fought them off and saved lots of Jews, and they weren't as bad as the Germans. And so, there's this whole mythology of how good, Italian people are that is summed up in that phrase. This self-image is also helped along by the fact that Italians have very little real memory of their own colonial past. So, to be granted, it was, it had a small footprint. It was not like the French or the British Empire. It was quite small. But nonetheless, it's something which just doesn't, it's not really present in the Italian imaginary. And when it is, it's depicted in these idealized terms. For example, the image that I'm seeing at the right that you can't see very well is from a publication of the 1930s, so the fascist period. With colonial pretensions in the Horn of Africa, and here the Italian soldier comes, plants the flag, and all of the black locals are thrilled and welcoming with open arms, kind of like was going to happen when the U.S. invaded Iraq, and So anyway, a very happy scene. The Italian also, I think, self-image is a particularly non-racist kind of place, is further aided, or maybe I should say manifested, by a really strong rejection of the very word race, or razza in Italian, in the modern lexicon. So in Italian today, razza is a word, it can mean a generic type of anything, but for other uses to refer to people, it has connotations that people tend to find very distasteful, and as a result, not use the word very much. I can't tell you how many times during my Fulbright year at the University of Milan, colleagues in the sociology department would tell me, I always tell my students never to use the word race. They shouldn't use that word race. It's just, it doesn't exist, and you just should never even use the word race. And for me to say, for example, in Italy, I never say that I'm a sociologist of race, faccio la sociologa di razza, because people would be like, it's terrible. I've tried to think of, well, let me back up a second. It not only has it got negative connotations, the term, it also sounds very obsolete and antiquated because it's quite associated with the fascist period, and particularly with what were called the racial laws of the 1930s, which were anti-Semitic laws. And so it has both this negative and antiquated connotation. And I've tried to think for American audiences of what would be a good parallel in American English, and the best example that I've come up with so far is the term mulatto, right? Because that's a term we don't really use today. I think it sounds obsolete and antiquated. We don't normally call Obama a mulatto president, right? And not only does it sound somewhat obsolete and antiquated, but I think it also has the negative connotation of being associated with the era of slavery. It kind of seems to speak of that era, and so that's all kind of bundled up in a negative way. And the word razza for Italians is kind of like that. Now, I've talked about things that are, I think that Italy shares with other Western European countries that makes it a good site for testing out this comparison about US and Western European concepts of difference. However, there are also some things that are specific to Italy, which I want to argue actually that also make it a good site. So I'm sort of trying to have my cake and eat it too by saying, well, it's a good representative of Western Europe in general, but also there are things about it that are different that are also really great for our study. So hopefully I can persuade you. One thing that sort of sets Italy apart from some of its neighbors is that it's relatively understudied. Its immigration and the consequences of that immigration are somewhat understudied outside of Italy. But also, more particular to what's going on domestically, first of all, it's a very interesting site because it has such a heterogeneous immigrant population. If you were to look at what were the top sending countries of immigrants to Italy, you would see Romania, you would see Morocco, you would see China. So very different places. And this heterogeneity of the immigrant population is very nice for us because it gives us kind of a wide canvas to work with when we ask people about their notions of difference. So we get to explore when they're thinking about Albanians and Moroccans and Senegalese, we get a lot of different kinds of groupings to sort of tease out what they think of as salient differences. For the same reason, Italy's traditional division between North and South is also kind of helpful for us, as giving us some variation to explore. It's important because in Italy, this regional division, this geographic division, is also historically a heavily racialized division. So it's not just, a directional, a geographical thing, but it's really a racialized understanding, with Northerners thinking about Southerners as inferior. And not only that, but their inferiority is also linked to their proximity to Africa. So there's a saying in Italian that Africa starts at Rome, which, so everybody south of Rome is really African. It manages to be insulting both to Southern Italians and Africans simultaneously. But, the idea is very much that there's kind of a racial gradient in the country. Then finally, another characteristic specific to Italy that I think is very interesting for our work is that it hasn't got quite, in this heterogeneity that it has, it's not arrayed along a black-white spectrum in the same way that we might expect in the United States. That is, in survey after survey, when Italians are asked about how they feel about different groups, it is far from given that they'll say, we really like Italians the best, and then we like, Eastern Europeans, and at the bottom are Sub-Saharan Africans. It's quite far from that. And in fact, I'm giving you an example here of just one survey where Italians were asked which groups they thought of as being most likable. So for them at the very top, they put Filipinos, then they're followed by Senegalese. So we go from Southeast Asia to West Africa, then we go to Egyptians in North Africa, then to Sri Lankans in South Asia. So we're not getting any quite strict, color gradient, best to worst. And in fact, at the very bottom of the list are Albanians, the only European group that was even questioned, was asked about in this survey. And you see this in other surveys as well, that when Italians are asked, who do you think is more likely to be honest, hardworking, very often, African immigrants will be at the top of the list and Eastern Europeans will be at the bottom, right? So again, it's a particular texture that makes for an interesting background for trying to ferret out people's thinking about difference. Now, having said all that, I do not want to leave you with the impression that Italy is somehow a colorblind country. So let's get to that and to the soccer player Mario Balotelli. Color is very salient in Italy, and what I'm showing you here is kind of a hodgepodge of events that I'll talk about. So we'll start with the example of the soccer player Mario Balotelli. How many of you have heard of him, Balotelli? Oh, wow, okay, all right, so a lot of people, right? So then you probably know that Balotelli is of Ghanaian origin, but adopted and raised, I think practically from birth in Italy. The guy is 100% Italian. He has a strong northern accent from his town of Brescia. He doesn't speak anything but Italian. The guy is Italian for all intents and purposes. However, on the playing field throughout Italy, he faces the most horrendous kind of torments. I'm actually showing one of the milder ones here, which is that it's often, he often faces the cries, non ci sono negri italiani. There are no black Italians. There's a depiction of him at the right as King Kong, right? There are banana peels thrown at him, so forth and so on. So there's this constant rejection of him, not on the basis of his culture, because culturally he is as Italian as they come. So it's really a reaction to his color that's motivating this animus. Similarly, in the bottom right, I show an example of a young man who was beaten to death in Milan a couple of years ago. Actually, this was, I think, in the month that I arrived for my sabbatical in Italy. So I was like, whoa, I came to the right place to study this stuff. He was beaten to death for stealing a packet of cookies from a bar, and beaten to death by the bar's owners, crying, who's filthy black, and beat him with steel pipes. Finally, from a more recent event, I want to give an example of Italy's first black minister. She was named to its second most recent government. You may not know, but the government changed last week. Right? It happens all the time, as you know. So now there's a new government, but in the previous government of a week ago, there was a black minister named Cecile Kyenge. Again, somebody of African origin, but grew up in Italy, fluent in Italian, educated in Italy, so forth and so on, who also faced the most horrific racial epithets. And I give you a smattering here, and I should say also these epithets, we're not talking about comments from like the people on the street hanging around on the street corner. We're talking about the comments made to the press by senators in the parliament, right? So one such member of parliament said, oh, every time I see her, I think of an orangutan. I don't know what it is. She just looks like an orangutan to me. Again, captured here for ABC News. Another politician said, she's going to bring in, bonga bonga government. She's going to introduce tribal law to Italy. Just a level of discourse which is just so low that it's outstanding. And just kind of to put the icing on the cake, I want to show you images from a party. There's an annual party that fashion designers in Milan throw. This year the theme was Disco Africa. Go figure. And here's some of the ways that guests thought would be a good idea to dress for this party, covered in the press, right? Including some of the party hosts here in the blackface at the top. Others thinking it was a good idea to come dressed as slaves, complete with chain, around the neck and everything. And again, my point in showing this to you is not just to say that color still has resonance in Italy, but also to make the point that we can see here too that the US and Italy, despite their differences, also inherit a shared cultural past of thinking about race and images about racial difference, right? They're both inheritors of a broader Western tradition of thinking about racial difference. And so we want to keep in mind, even as we explore the important differences between them, that there is a shared cultural ancestry that acts as a backdrop. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about what we did, so the data that we collected. Sorry, my partner put this on the thing where I have to keep pressing to get all the pieces to show up. So the comparative work that we did was interview-based. And, I did it too much. Sorry, guys. All right, let me go. Excuse me, let me get back to where I want it to be. And I should say that since this work, it really grew out of my work in the United States, that what happened was we started with data I had collected, interviews that I had conducted with undergraduate students in the United States with a sample of a little over 50 college students in the Northeast. And because we sort of had that as a starting point, in Italy we tried to mimic that to a certain extent by also interviewing college students. And there we interviewed 75 students in 3 different cities going from north to south, so in Milan, Bologna, and Naples. We also have added a sample of vocational school students. So to get away from the eliteness of the university setting, we've also interviewed vocational school students in Milan, but I don't have those results to show to you today. In both places, though, we tried to get students in a mix of disciplines. Now, something really important to note about our process for interviewing people was that although in the United States I had interviewed students about race and how they thought about race, I couldn't take that approach in Italy because just the word razza just doesn't resonate. It's not used in the same way. And so we tried to think instead about, if race is a primary way in which people think about descent-based differences in the United States, what would be a comparable, salient framework for Italians? And we settled on the comparison of Italians and non-Italians. Now, why do we do this? Well, we give people, in a sense, we sort of channel people's ideas a little bit using this language because we didn't want to ask questions that were so open-ended, like, what groups do you like or not like, and, end up talking about skateboarders and, gardeners and stuff like that. We wanted to keep people focused on descent-based groups. We also wanted to use terms that would be language that would be familiar to people. But we also felt that both of these framings had the advantage of leaving open the possibility of people giving us a whole range of answers. That is, we weren't forcing them to conceive of difference in particular ways. That is, they could describe these differences by race or by Italian versus non-Italian in biological terms, in cultural terms, in socioeconomic terms, however they might see fit. So we felt that we were not doing violence, in a sense, to their notions of difference. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just show you some of the preliminary findings that we have. And I'm going to start with ways in which the Italians that we interviewed thought about group differences. So how did we get at this? We asked students a series of questions about Italians and non-Italians. We asked, for example, who do you think should be considered as, Italian, as part of the Italian people? What kinds of people or who living in Italy today do you think is not Italian? Who would you not include in the Italian category? What do you think are the differences between those groups? Can non-Italians become Italian? So through all of these kinds of questions, we tried to get at what were the kinds of differences that seem to be most salient for people in distinguishing Italian from non-Italian. So the results here show the percentage of interviewees that mentioned a certain kind of difference when they answered these questions that we put to them. So here, quite consistent actually with the new racism theory, we saw that Italians very frequently mentioned culture, some aspect of culture, as being the salient difference between who's Italian and who's not, often framed in terms of differences of food, language, values, religion, so forth and so on. Also, a very widespread way of thinking about differences or about couching them was to refer to differences in behaviors. So, who works hard, who respects the law. And this kind of verges on the culture because there's sort of a blending with what people do and what reflects the values ostensibly of their cultural groups. Okay? Then, not surprisingly, for some people, the difference between Italian and non-Italian was first and foremost, or at least importantly, a matter of a legal difference. Do you have citizenship? Have you got resident status? And so forth and so on. But after that tier of more frequent kind of answers, then we get to a second tier of much less popular answers, and that's really where we see the kind of biology, physical characteristics coming in. So it was much less frequent that people would characterize differences between Italian and non-Italians as a matter of physical makeup or blood or things like that. Okay. Now, one other thing that I would like to point out, especially to an American audience about the ways in which Italians thought about these differences, is that they saw the weight or the import of these differences in ways that I think that are somewhat different than Americans would. And I get at this in the following way. So we asked people in another series of questions about integration and which groups they felt could be integrated into Italian society. And so we asked them the same question 3 times, just varying the term. Would you agree that some cultures cannot be integrated into Italian society? Would you agree that some ethnic groups cannot be integrated? And then finally, some races. And what's very striking here is that for Italians, it's really your cultural group that is much more significant, much more meaningful in terms of whether you could be integrated or not. And race for them, for the most part, seemed much less important. And in fact, when people were asked to comment on whether race might be something that would be an impediment for a group's integration in Italian society, the reaction was largely, kind of a head scratching. Why would race matter? It's just your skin color. So what would that have to do with your integration in society? It was kind of as if in the United States I had asked, does hair color have an impact on people's integration in society? And we would sort of say, no, why would it matter that you have red hair or not? And that sort of seemed to be Italians' first take when asked about how race might matter. And instead for them, what really had weight were people's cultural practices. That was really the make or break division for integration. Now I'm going to move to a more direct comparison between our results in the US and Italy to talk about what happened when we asked people in both countries to comment on race specifically. So in both countries, we asked our interviewees if they believed that there are biological races in our species. And we take this phrase from a survey that someone else fielded a couple of years ago. So here, not surprisingly, Americans were more likely to say that they believed there were biological races in the human species. However, what I actually find notable about this is that it's not as if that belief was non-existent in Italy. Roughly 1/3 of the students that we happened to interview thought that that was a true characterization. And I think that really goes against the expectation of the new racism theory that, just biological race would be something that would be completely, unacceptable or unvoiced in a Western European context. Now, the other thing that we asked people in both countries was, or one of the other things we asked in both places, was how people would define the term race. And I'll start with my results in the US, going over them very briefly because I've detailed them other places, and then talk more about the results from Italy. So when I asked students this question in the US of how they would define race, the number one answer that I got was to talk about race in terms of cultural difference. So this student who says, I think it kind of has a lot to do with like what culture you're coming from and like you're different. I mean, everything from like how you eat, what you eat, to what you wear, to like, I mean, the language, everything. So that was a fairly common kind of answer that I got when talking to American students. But almost as frequent an answer was for them to also describe race in terms of biology. And the reason that the percentages that I'm showing here don't add up is because people often draw on more than one explanation. And in particular, and this was actually a surprise to me doing the research, that the cultural definition and the biological definition didn't seem to be at odds with each other for the people that I interviewed. They seemed to work together just fine. So here we have a quote from a biology major who says, well, like, I personally think it's just a matter of, physiological differences that occur simply because of the environment. So this emphasis both on physiological or genetic characteristics and those characteristics being produced through a process of human evolution was a very common way for people taking a biological tack and describing race to reason. And then finally, a much smaller share of the students I interviewed really talked about and thought about race as being best understood as a social construct. I have to say I was a little chagrined that this viewpoint, it wasn't more widespread in the sample where anthropology majors were quite overrepresented. I oversampled anthropology majors because I was interested in the effect of the teaching that discipline, and even despite my oversample of anthropology majors, not a lot of people seem to really find helpful or useful the idea of social construction as a way of understanding what race was. And I could tell also in my interviews that often they didn't quite get it. They would say, well, yeah, I think race is a cultural construct. It's like you have your culture and I have my culture, so we're different. So that's not quite the sense of social constructionism, but so I could tell there was just not a lot of clarity among undergraduates about what that idea aimed at. Now, when we asked the same question of Italians, here to my surprise, the number one answer that Italians gave when asked what race was to define it in biological terms. And here in these quotes from various interviews with Italian students, we see a lot of the same themes. So race being based on physical characteristics. We see also the language of Caucasians, that sort of held over. In the second quote, I want to point to the mention of animals. So towards the end of the second quote, this person says that's a race which exists in man, it exists in dogs, exists in all animals. And I'm going to come back to that mention of animals later. And in the third quote, this student again gives us this evolutionary theory of race, right? In my view, race is the result of adaptation to the natural environment. And then this kind of like nonsensical, for example, blacks had to have dark skin because they're African, but whatever. We know where they're trying to go, and it's with an environmental kind of argument. Also very common, although not as much in our Italian interviews, was a different kind of tack that was somewhat different from what we saw among American students, and that was to insist simply that race just did not exist. There was nothing to talk about because it just does not exist. I'll use the quote in the middle. I think it gets a lot of this. A woman who said, "Oh, mama, since I was little, I was always told not to use that word, race, even in elementary school. They always taught me to use it just for animals. So there's one human race and one only, and race is only biology. So exactly what separates a dog from a horse from a human being." And in the last quote at the bottom, we also get at the ways in which the word race is very much associated with a troubling past. So this student says the term race I would define as a term from the past, overcome or bypassed, superato, and bothersome because it tried to define in terms of biological diversity a kind of hierarchical scale of differences of varied kinds. Now, sort of in last place among the interviews was an equation of race with culture. It wasn't the most common way to do it, but it was not infrequent either. It was also part of what came up. So this idea that race is sort of another way of saying ethnicity. It's a more derogatory word for ethnicity. So to sum up these comparisons from the interviews, I want to point to both commonalities that jump out. So one, particularly looking at the mass of all the interviews, it becomes clear that both in the United States and in Italy, the term race has very heavy biological connotations. it also, and this may be less evident from the quotes that I show, but there's also a pretty widespread belief that knowing what race is really a matter of scientific proficiency. So race is a scientific term, and we just have to know what the term is, what the definition is that scientists are using. We just, to get on the same page with them. But that race is ultimately something that we can best understand through our study of the natural sciences. And then finally, in both countries, students expressed a lot of ethical concerns about dealing with the term race, using the term race. And that, again, that was true in the US as well as in Italy. But there are also, I think, some very important differences. In the United States, or rather, it's only in the United States that we see the language of race as socially constructed. And I understand from my partner in Milan that that idea, race as a social construct, it just hasn't made the same inroads in the Italian Academy the way it has made in American classrooms, perhaps in part because faculty there don't even want to use the word race. So, it's just not a mantra that you're going to be getting at your education at the University of Bologna. But what that means, an implication of that is that by thinking about race as a social construct, American students are also able to imagine race as a contemporary social phenomenon. It may not be a biological characteristic, but it's a real system of grouping people that has a place in society today, that plays a role in society today. In Italy, instead, the thinking was that you didn't say that race was a social construct, you just said race didn't exist, there is no race. Or there used to be an idea about race, but that was in the past a long time ago, and anyway, people have given up that idea and it was wrong. But by taking that approach, by historicizing race, it means that there's no way to talk about ways in which race might be playing a role today. It was just a bad idea from the past that people have moved beyond, so there's nothing really to say about it anymore. Also, in Italy, it's striking, as we saw, students often incorporated reasoning about animals in their thinking about race, and that is for a very straightforward reason, I think. In Italian, the word razza is the word that we would use for breed. So you would say, like, the bovine race, the porcine race, to talk about races of cows and pigs and so forth and so on. So kind of the association with animals suggests itself. And then finally, in Italy, we often saw an elision between the terms race and racism. So although we were asking people to talk about race, they would read it immediately as a question about racism. And I give an example of that here. So with these very preliminary findings, admittedly, we are, I don't know how I managed to do that. Okay, whoops. Sorry, guys, this is where I want to go. It's kind of the conclusion, the tentative conclusion, I should say, that we're starting to work towards is that the new racism theory, which suggests that cultural racism prevails in Europe, biological racism in the United States, is not really an accurate picture of what's going on the ground, that it kind of exaggerates differences between the US and Western Europe. Now, it's true, we find support for the idea that when Italians are asked to talk about difference, that cultural examples, that culture comes very strongly to the fore for them. We also saw that they're less likely than Americans are to define race in biological terms. But having said that, we also see that biological notions of difference are far from, invisible, and they've hardly disappeared in Italy. They're still very much there. And we're also seeing that Americans also are using the language of culture to a fair extent in talking about race, more so than might be predicted by new racism theory. So the last piece that I want to leave you with then is sort of our ruminations about why it might be the case then that scholars have exaggerated this distinction between US and Europe. What might have led to that reading of a dichotomy when in fact the empirical situation doesn't seem to warrant that. One explanation we think might to do with fact, or might to do with the origins. Wow, my spacing is really messed up. Okay. Might have to do with the origins of new racism theory, that a lot of the work in this literature was done looking at European countries by European scholars, and we think it might be possible that in a sense the European origins of the theory might have something to do with the claim. That is, perhaps European scholars have sought to disassociate themselves and disassociate the content from American ways of thinking about race, and this theory does that. One scholar, El Tayeb, argues, she says that in Europe, there's a powerful narrative of Europe as a colorblind continent, largely untouched by the devastating ideology it exported all over the world, right? So somehow this belief that, somehow they invented it, but now they have nothing to do with it, and, just the rest of us are living with race. So that might be part of why there's been this perhaps exaggerated dichotomy between the US and Western Europe. Another reason might be, okay, sorry guys. Okay. Another reason might be that, I'm sorry guys, I need to see what happened to my, good, okay. Another reason that I want to suggest is that scholars perhaps have been fooled or misled into thinking that ideas are very different on either side of the Atlantic because the language is different, the kind of terminology is used, that the terms and the kind of the discursive strategies are different in Western Europe and the US. So it makes it seem as if they're thinking very different things when perhaps in fact they're thinking rather similar things but couching it in different language, so that perhaps, an American says race, an Italian talks about ethnia, but maybe they're kind of thinking about the same thing. And then finally, in a somewhat similar vein, we want to suggest that what may be going on is that although Americans may be thinking more about biology and Europeans are thinking more about culture, that in a sense they have connotations with each of those that make them similar, so similar as to be functional equivalents. Okay, that's not me at all. Okay, I don't know where, I think I just lost my, am I there? Can you find my?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. And I just want to go back one. Actually, I can just sum it up very quickly. The idea is simply that although Americans may be thinking in terms of biology, what's important is that for them, biology is what matters and what is consequential in terms of social stratification, right? And we're all familiar with the claims in the United States about your genes making you less intelligent or better in sports or, more likely to vote and, all this kind of stuff that's coming out. So in the US, but your biology has a weight and a consequence to it that in Italy, Italians seem to attribute to culture. We saw that for them, it's your culture that matters in terms of integration. And that matters, your culture is what matters in terms of how you behave, you act, are you a good citizen, law-abiding, and so forth. So again, people may be using different terms that, again, make scholars think that we're looking at very different kinds of mental landscapes, but in fact, those different terms may have very similar connotations so that we can find more similarity across the Atlantic than we might otherwise expect. So on that note, I am going to leave you with some beautiful pictures of Italy, the idealized Italy that we all like to think about. And I thank you in advance for your questions and your comments. Thank you.